Hello and welcome. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Take a moment and let me know in the comments, whether it's morning in Melbourne, late evening in London, or the middle of the night, somewhere in between. There's something grounding about knowing where everyone is in this moment we're sharing together. But here's what I want you to understand before we dive in. What you're about to experience is not a race. There's nowhere to be, nothing to prove. This is the kind of content designed for a particular state of mind, the kind where time becomes less important, where your usual sense of urgency loosens its grip. You might be lying in bed, you might be on a couch, you might be in a place where you're safe and can just let information wash over you without needing to do anything with it except listen. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore 50 moments from human history that most people have never encountered. These aren't the facts you learned in school. They're not the dramatic stories that have been told 1,000 times. They're the hidden stories, the strange stories, the moments when human history was far stranger and more fascinating than anyone told you. And what's remarkable is that these stories are all true. Every single one of them actually happened. But before we get to those stories, I need to tell you something that will make you want to keep watching. History, the real history, the untold history, is far more interesting than fiction. And tonight, you're going to discover why. You're going to encounter moments where human beings did things that seem almost impossible. You're going to learn about connections between events that you never knew existed. You're going to understand that the world we live in now is the result of countless small moments and big decisions that almost no one knows about. So settle in, get comfortable, let your mind relax, because we're about to take a journey through time, and what you discover might change how you see the world. The Roman sewage system and modern disease. When we think of the Roman Empire, we often imagine grand architecture and military power. But what most people don't know is that the Romans had a sophisticated sewage system that was so advanced that it wasn't equaled in Europe again until the 1800s. The main sewer of Rome, the Cloaca Maxima, was built around 600 BC and still exists today. But here's what's truly remarkable. During the medieval period after Rome fell, European cities abandoned these sewage systems. They reverted to throwing human waste directly into streets and rivers. This wasn't just unpleasant, it directly caused the spread of disease for over 1,000 years. The Black Death and countless other plagues were made significantly worse by the fact that medieval cities had rejected the very technology that could have prevented them. Human beings had the knowledge to prevent catastrophic disease, and then they forgot it. They literally went backward. Cleopatra was closer to the moon landing than to the pyramids. Most people assume that Cleopatra lived in ancient Egypt surrounded by the pyramids as monuments to her ancestors, but the mathematics of time reveals something startling. Cleopatra lived from 69 BC to 30 BC. The pyramids were built around 2500 BC. That means Cleopatra lived closer to the time of the moon landing in 1969 than to the construction of the pyramids. She would have looked at the pyramids much the way we look at ancient ruins from 2,000 years ago. They were already incredibly old to her. The pyramids had already been standing for over 2,000 years when she came to power. This completely changes how we think about the timeline of human civilization. Napoleon's height and historical propaganda. One of the most persistent myths about history is that Napoleon was incredibly short. In countless jokes and references, he's depicted as a tiny man with a Napoleon complex. But the actual historical record shows that Napoleon was approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was actually average height for a Frenchman at the time. The myth of his shortness came partly from British propaganda. His enemies deliberately spread the idea that he was diminutive and weak. They created caricatures that exaggerated his height differences with other men, and this propaganda was so effective that even today, centuries later, people still believe Napoleon was abnormally short. His actual legacy was shaped in part by the deliberate misinformation campaigns against him. The Library of Alexandria and what we lost. The Library of Alexandria is famous for being burned and destroyed, but what most people don't realize is that it was destroyed not once, but multiple times, and by different forces. A fire during Julius Caesar's civil war destroyed parts of it. Then religious authorities damaged it further. Then it was destroyed again, and with each destruction, we lost countless texts. But what's even more sobering is that we only know about the Library of Alexandria because of occasional references in other texts. The actual scale of what was lost is almost impossible to calculate. We know we lost most of the works of ancient playwrights. We lost scientific texts. We lost philosophical works. We lost records of civilizations. And what we have now is probably only a small fraction of what existed. The gap in our knowledge of ancient history is partly a direct result of these destructions. The Voynich manuscript and historical mysteries. In 1512, a mysterious book surfaced that has never been fully decoded. The Voynich manuscript is written in an unknown language or cipher. It contains detailed illustrations of plants that no botanist can identify, astronomical diagrams, and recipe-like instructions that make no sense. It's been owned by various collectors and institutions, and despite centuries of attempts by cryptographers and historians, no one has definitively figured out what it says or what it is. Some believe it's an elaborate hoax. Some believe it's a genuine document from a lost civilization or written in a deliberately obscure code. The point is that there are historical mysteries still sitting in our archives that we haven't solved. There are objects that have been preserved through centuries that remain fundamentally mysterious. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1900, Greek sponge divers discovered a shipwreck off the island of Antikythera. Among the artifacts was a mysterious bronze device covered in gears and inscriptions. For decades, no one knew what it was. Then, as technology advanced and we could examine it more carefully, we realized it was an ancient astronomical calculator. It was created sometime between 270 BC and 60 BC. It appears to have been used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. The sophistication of this device suggests that ancient Greek technology was far more advanced than we previously understood, but then it was lost to history. No other similar device from that era has been found. It's possible that this technology existed for a while and then was somehow lost or abandoned. We don't know what happened to the knowledge that created this device. The Inca Quipu recording system. The Inca Empire covered a vast area and included millions of people. They kept detailed records, but they didn't use a written language the way we think of it. Instead, they used a system called Quipu, which was a series of knotted cords. Different colored cords and different types of knots recorded different information. It was a three-dimensional writing system, and it was devastatingly effective. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they destroyed the Quipus as they conquered the territory. They burned many of them because they didn't understand them and saw them as instruments of paganism. As a result, we lost countless records of Inca history, population, resources, and culture. If the Quipus had been preserved, we would understand much more about pre-Columbian South America. The destruction of the Quipus was a direct loss to human knowledge. The Baghdad Battery. In the 1930s, archaeologists in Iraq discovered a series of small clay jars containing copper and iron rods. They were dated to around 200 BC. When examined, they appeared to be galvanic cells, essentially ancient batteries. If you filled them with an acidic liquid, they would generate electrical current. For decades, this discovery was largely ignored or dismissed, but as we've studied them more carefully, we've realized that someone in ancient Baghdad may have possessed the knowledge to generate electrical current, We don't know what they used these batteries for. We don't know if they were used for electroplating or medical purposes or something else entirely. But the fact that they existed suggests that ancient knowledge was more sophisticated and more lost than we realize. The Library of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, accumulated one of the most valuable libraries in medieval Europe. It contained books on science, theology, literature, and history. But after Ivan died in 1584, the library disappeared. It was never found. No historian knows what happened to it. Some believe it was hidden by Ivan or his family before his death. Some believe it was destroyed by enemies. Some believe it still exists somewhere, hidden in a vault beneath Moscow or another location. The fact that a major collection of medieval knowledge simply vanished is remarkable. Somewhere, there may be a collection of books that could tell us much more about medieval Russia and European intellectual history, but they remain lost. The Tocharians and the mummies of China. In the early 1900s, archaeologists discovered naturally preserved mummies in the Tarim Basin in northwestern China. These mummies had European physical features. They were blonde and red-haired. DNA analysis showed they were Indo-European in origin. The Tocharians, as they came to be known, inhabited this region from around 2000 BC to 1000 AD. They spoke a language that has since been lost. They were a people who lived on the Silk Road, connecting east and west, but they have been largely forgotten by history. Few people know about them. Their civilization was vast, and their contact with Chinese civilization was significant, yet they've faded almost entirely from historical consciousness. They're a reminder that entire civilizations can exist and then disappear from memory. The Code of Hammurabi and Lost Justice Systems. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the oldest known sets of laws, dating to around 1752 BC, but what most people don't realize is that it wasn't unique. There were other legal codes from ancient Mesopotamia, and there were likely even more that we haven't discovered yet. The Code of Hammurabi is famous partly because it survived, not because it was necessarily the most important or most advanced legal code of its time. We know only what has been preserved. There were probably countless legal systems and philosophical approaches to justice that existed in ancient civilizations that we have no record of. The laws we know about are accidents of preservation. A stone tablet survives when a papyrus document decays. A code carved in rock is preserved when one written on parchment is lost. Our understanding of ancient justice is incomplete by necessity. Göbekli Tepe and the Rewriting of History. In 1995, archaeologists in Turkey discovered Göbekli Tepe, an ancient temple complex that dates back to around 9500 BC. This is before agriculture. This is before we believed humans had settled into permanent structures. The site contains massive stone pillars arranged in circles, suggesting sophisticated religious or ceremonial practices. But what's remarkable is that it appears to have been deliberately buried sometime after its construction. Massive quantities of dirt and stone were piled on top of it. Someone in the ancient past decided to bury this temple and hide it from view. We don't know why. We don't know if it was a religious practice or if something traumatic happened there. But its existence has forced us to completely rewrite what we thought we knew about the development of human civilization. It shows that organized religion and monumental architecture may have developed before agriculture, contrary to what we previously believed. The Library of Nag Hammadi. In 1945, a peasant in Egypt discovered a collection of ancient texts in sealed jars. These texts were religious and philosophical works from the early Christian period. They included gospels that had been lost for nearly 2,000 years. These texts revealed alternative strands of early Christianity that had been suppressed or forgotten. They showed that early Christian thought was far more diverse than we realized. Competing ideas about who Jesus was, what his message meant, and what salvation meant existed simultaneously. These alternative gospels were eventually declared heretical and destroyed. The fact that copies survived buried in the Egyptian desert means we can see that early Christian history was far more complex than the official church history suggests. There were branches of Christianity that disappeared entirely because they didn't win the theological and political battles that determined which beliefs would become dominant. The death of Mozart and historical mysteries. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died in 1791 at the age of 35. The official cause of death was acute miliary fever, a disease that was not well understood at the time. But we don't actually know what killed Mozart. His body was buried in a mass grave, which was common practice at the time. Later investigations suggested he may have died from kidney failure, typhus, or several other possible causes. The mystery of Mozart's death has led to countless theories and historical investigations. Some people claim he was poisoned. Some believe it was a disease now lost to history. Some think it was a combination of factors. The point is that we have a famous historical figure, someone whose entire life and works have been well documented, and we still don't know how he died. History is full of these kinds of mysteries, where we have incomplete information and must make educated guesses about what actually happened. The Copper Scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, they included a unique text written on copper rather than parchment. The Copper Scroll contains a list of locations where treasure was supposedly hidden. It describes gold and silver and precious items allegedly buried or hidden in various places around Jerusalem. The locations described in the scroll have been the subject of intense historical investigation. Some scholars believe the treasure is real and waiting to be found. Others think the scroll is a description of temple treasure from before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. Others believe it's entirely fictional or a map to a place that no longer exists. What makes the Copper Scroll fascinating is that it represents a mystery embedded in history. We have a document that seems to be saying something very real and specific, but we can't verify whether its claims are true. The Antikythera wreck and submerged history. The shipwreck that contained the Antikythera mechanism was just one wreck. Divers have now identified hundreds of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, each containing artifacts and information about ancient trade, technology, and culture. But most of these wrecks remain only partially explored or not explored at all. The Mediterranean floor holds countless artifacts and structures that have never been studied. There are likely ruins of ancient buildings and settlements underwater that we haven't discovered yet. The fact that so much of human history is literally submerged beneath the sea means our understanding of ancient civilization is incomplete. We don't know what we're missing because we haven't looked in many places yet. And as sea levels have changed throughout history, there may be archaeological sites that are now underwater but were once on dry land. The decline of Latin and language lost. Latin was the dominant language of the Western Roman Empire. As the empire fell apart, Latin fragmented into what would become the Romance languages. But in the process, countless texts and records written in Latin were lost. Libraries burned, monasteries were destroyed. Texts that existed in only one or two copies were lost forever. During the medieval period, many classical texts were deliberately destroyed because they were seen as pagan or heretical. Some texts survived only because they were copied into the margins of religious manuscripts or hidden in monastery libraries. When we read ancient literature today, we're often reading texts that survived somewhat by accident. Many ancient authors had multiple works, but we have only one or two. Some ancient philosophers we know only through references in other texts. Our knowledge of ancient intellectual history is fragmentary by necessity. The lost Gospels and early Christianity beyond the library of Nag Hammadi, there are references to many Gospels in early Christian texts that no longer exist. The Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and dozens of others are referenced in historical texts, but the original documents are gone. We know they existed because later church fathers wrote arguments against them or mentioned them in passing, but we don't have their full texts. Early Christian history as we know it is based partly on what survived the selective process of which texts were considered canonical and worth preserving. Other versions and interpretations of Jesus' teachings disappeared. The Christianity we know today is the version that won the theological debates and had the resources to preserve its texts. Other versions vanished. The Library of Alexandria's true contents. We think we know what was in the Library of Alexandria because ancient writers mentioned specific works and authors, but the truth is, we have no comprehensive inventory. We know the library contained thousands of scrolls, but we don't know exactly how many or what the complete collection was. We only know about the most famous works and authors because they're mentioned in texts that survived. There were probably thousands of works in the library that were not so famous, not so often referenced, that have vanished entirely. We know of entire genres of literature that must have existed because of passing references, but don't have direct copies of their works. The loss of the library was the loss of countless unique voices and unique knowledge that never reached future generations. The Tarim Basin trade routes and lost knowledge. The Tarim Basin in western China was the crossroads of ancient trade. The Silk Road ran through it. It connected Chinese civilization with Indian, Persian, and eventually European civilizations. In this region, multiple languages were spoken, multiple religions practiced, multiple cultures intersected. Archaeological sites in the Tarim Basin have revealed bilingual texts showing that people who lived there were fluent in multiple languages. They were traders, merchants, and cultural intermediaries. But when the Mongol Empire fell and trade routes changed, the Tarim Basin became isolated. Some of the cities were abandoned. The population moved to other areas. The unique multicultural civilization that had developed in the Tarim Basin gradually disappeared. The knowledge and culture of these trading communities was largely lost. The Etruscan civilization and undecoded language before Rome dominated the Italian peninsula. The Etruscan civilization was a major power. The Etruscans were skilled engineers, artists, and merchants. They influenced Roman culture significantly, but the Etruscan language has never been fully deciphered. We can read Etruscan text phonetically because it uses an alphabet we understand, but the meaning of many texts remains obscure. We don't fully understand their culture, their beliefs, their history. There are Etruscan texts on thousands of artifacts, but their meaning is partially lost to us. The Etruscan civilization was absorbed into Roman civilization, and much of their unique cultural knowledge was lost in that process. The antediluvian myths and ancient civilizations. Many ancient cultures had myths about a great flood that destroyed civilization. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews, cultures across the world all had flood myths. Some scholars believe these myths refer to an actual flood event that affected early human populations. Others believe they're metaphorical, but the fact that so many unconnected cultures had similar myths suggests either actual events that influenced human memory or a deep human psychological need to create narratives about cataclysmic change. The truth about what these myths represent is obscured by the mists of time, the unknown peoples of the Americas. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they found complex civilizations. The Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, the various Pueblo peoples, and hundreds of other distinct groups were living there. But between the collapse of earlier civilizations, like the ancestral Puebloans, and the arrival of Europeans, there were gaps in the historical record. Cities were abandoned. Civilizations rose and fell. We know some of this history because of archaeology and surviving records, but much remains unknown. There were peoples and civilizations in the Americas before the Spanish conquest that we have no names for, no detailed knowledge of. They existed and left traces, but most of their history is lost. The paper trail of history and what survives. An important factor in what we know about history is what medium information was recorded on. Clay tablets survive, stone inscriptions survive, papyrus sometimes survives in dry climates, but paper, parchment, and animal skin don't survive unless conditions are perfect. Most of the information from ancient and medieval periods was probably recorded on perishable materials. We have no way of knowing what percentage of historical records has been lost simply because the material it was written on decayed. This is true of any historical period. The historical record we have is skewed toward whatever materials survived. Civilizations that recorded information on clay or stone have better preservation. Those that used organic materials have less remaining. The Library of Babylon and lost Assyrian records. The great libraries of ancient Mesopotamia contained cuneiform tablets with legal records, literary works, scientific observations, and administrative documents. But we've only found a fraction of what likely existed. Many of these libraries were destroyed in wars. Some were buried when cities were abandoned. We have discovered some impressive collections, like the Library of Ashurbanipal, but we know these are incomplete. There were likely other libraries as significant that we've never discovered or that were destroyed without leaving any trace of their existence. The unknown extent of Roman engineering. We know the Romans built aqueducts, roads, and buildings throughout their empire, but we're constantly discovering previously unknown Roman structures. Archaeologists find Roman roads that were completely forgotten. They discover villas and settlements that were unknown. Every year brings new discoveries of Roman engineering that had been completely lost to history. This suggests that the extent of Roman civilization was even greater than we realize, and much of it has simply been buried or erased. The Indus Valley Civilization script. The Indus Valley Civilization existed from approximately 2600 BC to 1900 BC in what is now Pakistan and India. They had sophisticated urban planning, evidence of trade networks, and a writing system. But the script of the Indus Valley Civilization has never been deciphered. We have thousands of inscribed artifacts, but we can't read them. This means that an entire civilization's historical record is essentially unavailable to us. We know the Indus Valley people existed because of their physical remains, but their own words and records are locked away in a language we don't understand. The Nabatean Kingdom and lost trade networks. The Nabateans were an Arab people who created a powerful kingdom centered on the Negev desert. They controlled trade routes and built cities like Petra. But after the Roman annexation of the Nabatean Kingdom, their unique culture gradually disappeared. The cities were abandoned or repurposed. The Nabatean language was replaced by Arabic. Their distinctive way of life was absorbed into larger empires. We know about Petra because it was carved into rock, so it survived. But much of Nabatean culture and knowledge is lost. The Library of Pergamon. In the ancient world, Pergamon was a major intellectual center with a great library. The library was housed in a great building and contained thousands of volumes. But when Rome conquered Pergamon, many of the books were transferred to other locations or lost. The library that had been a center of learning ceased to exist as a functioning institution. The collection was scattered. Many texts that might have been preserved in Pergamon were lost to history. The unknown fate of many ancient authors. We know the names of many ancient authors only because later writers quoted them or mentioned them. We have no surviving works by them. These authors existed, wrote texts that were read and appreciated in their own time, but those texts did not survive. They could have been important works of philosophy, history, science, or literature. We'll never know because the texts themselves are gone. We only know that the authors existed and that people in antiquity took their work seriously enough to reference them. The Gothic and Vandal contributions to history. The Goths and Vandals are often portrayed as destructive barbarians in Roman histories, but they were sophisticated peoples with their own cultures and capabilities. Yet most of what we know about them comes from Roman sources, which were often biased. They wrote in different languages than Latin and Greek, languages that weren't as well preserved. As a result, our understanding of Gothic and Vandal civilization is very limited compared to Roman civilization. We know about them mainly through their interactions with Rome, not through their own records. The Scythian civilizations and nomadic history. The Scythians were a confederation of nomadic peoples who inhabited the steppes north of the Black Sea and Caucasus regions. They were known for their horsemanship, their craftsmanship, and their fierce warrior culture. But because they were nomadic, they left fewer permanent structures and fewer written records. Much of what we know about them comes from artifacts found in burial mounds and from descriptions by Greek and Roman authors. Our knowledge of their history and culture is fragmentary compared to settled civilizations. The Hittite Empire and ancient Near Eastern history. The Hittites were a major power in the ancient Near East during the second millennium BC. They rivaled Egypt for dominance, but after their empire collapsed, much of their history was lost. We've recovered some of their records, particularly from the site of Boğazköy in Turkey, but much more has probably been lost. The Hittites kept records on clay tablets, which survived better than other materials, but we've only found a fraction of what probably existed. Their unique contributions to ancient law, warfare, and diplomacy are incompletely understood because our sources are incomplete. The Library of Jerusalem and Lost Jewish Texts. After the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, many Jewish texts and records were lost or scattered. Some were preserved by Jewish communities in other locations. Some were preserved in quotations by later authors. But the complete Library of Jerusalem, if one existed, is gone. We know of Jewish texts from antiquity only through fragments and quotations. The intellectual heritage of ancient Judaism is incomplete as a result. The Mongol archives and lost imperial records. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors created a vast administrative system. They kept records of their territories, their populations, their military campaigns, but most of the Mongol archives have not survived or have not been discovered. We have some historical records written about the Mongols, often by their conquered subjects, but the Mongols' own records of their civilization are largely lost. We know about their conquests and their military campaigns, but much of their internal history and administrative practices are unknown. The Library of Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire and was a great center of learning. It had a significant library containing Greek, Roman, and Byzantine texts, but when Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, much of the library was lost or dispersed. Some texts were carried away by fleeing scholars. Others were destroyed. Some were repurposed or lost. The Byzantine preservation of ancient Greek and Roman texts was thus interrupted. Had Constantinople not been conquered, perhaps more classical texts would have been preserved, and our knowledge of ancient civilization would be greater. The Rosetta Stone and encoded history. The Rosetta Stone was crucial in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it's just one artifact. There are thousands of Egyptian texts that we still cannot fully understand. There are hieroglyphic inscriptions that contain gaps or ambiguities. There are texts whose meaning has been lost because we lack the context to understand them. The Rosetta Stone opened a door to understanding an ancient civilization, but that understanding remains incomplete. There are almost certainly Egyptian texts that contain knowledge or information that we're misinterpreting or completely failing to understand because we don't have the full context. The Zhenghe expeditions and a different history. In the early 1500s, the Chinese Ming Dynasty sent massive maritime expeditions under Zheng He across the Indian Ocean to Africa and beyond. These expeditions demonstrated extraordinary maritime capability and knowledge, but then they were abruptly stopped. The Chinese turned inward. They destroyed records of the expeditions and stopped exploring. As a result, Chinese maritime exploration, which could have led to Chinese colonization of the Americas or other continents, simply ended. History could have been very different. We know about these expeditions because some records survived, but the full knowledge of where Zheng He's fleet went and what they found is partially lost because records were deliberately destroyed. The Vinland map and historical controversies. In 1957, a map came to light that appeared to show the Norse discovery of North America around 500 years before Columbus. The map was called the Vinland map and showed a land labeled Vinland to the west of Greenland. The authenticity of the map has been hotly debated. Some experts believe it's a genuine medieval map. Others believe it's a 20th century forgery. The controversy remains unresolved. It's a reminder that historical artifacts sometimes resist definitive interpretation. We're not even sure whether some artifacts are authentic, let alone what they mean. The Nabatean alphabet and language evolution. The Nabatean script evolved into the Arabic script, but in the process of that evolution, the history of how the script developed and changed was not completely recorded. We have examples of the script from different periods, but the transitional forms and the reasons for specific changes are not fully documented. The history of how writing systems evolve is partially lost to time. The Mari archives and forgotten diplomatic records. In the ancient city of Mari on the Euphrates River, archaeologists discovered thousands of clay tablets containing administrative and diplomatic records from around 1800 BC. These tablets provide insights into the political structures and relationships of ancient Mesopotamian states, but Mari was just one city. How many other cities had similar archives that have been lost? How many cities were destroyed before their records could be preserved? The Mari archives give us a window into ancient diplomacy, but it's just one window. Countless others have been closed. The Gandhara civilization and Buddhist art. In the region between present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Gandhara civilization flourished from around the 1st century BC to the 11th century AD. They created a unique synthesis of Hellenistic and Buddhist art. Gandhara sculpture shows Buddhist figures rendered in a style influenced by Greek and Roman art. It's a testament to the cultural exchange along the Silk Road, but much of Gandhara art and culture was destroyed over time. Taliban destruction in the 21st century destroyed more Gandharan artifacts. We have only fragments of what was once a thriving cultural synthesis. The Nag Hammadi jar makers. The people who made the jars containing the Nag Hammadi texts, the place where they buried them, the reasons why they preserved these particular texts. All of this is unknown to us. We have the texts, but we don't know the context of their preservation. This is true for many archaeological artifacts. We find objects, but the people who created them, used them, or hid them are gone. We can only speculate about their intentions and their meanings. The Library of Caesarea, Origen of Alexandria, an important early Christian theologian, moved to Caesarea and helped establish its library. The library at Caesarea became a major center of Christian intellectual life, but much of it was lost over time. Texts that were copied there and preserved there are now known to us only through fragmentary references or through copies made elsewhere. The intellectual work done at Caesarea continues to influence Christianity, but our direct knowledge of it is incomplete. The forgotten technologies of antiquity. There are references in ancient texts to technologies that we've lost. Greek fire, the Byzantine military technology, is described in historical records, but we don't know exactly how it was made. Damascus steel production had a distinctive process that was lost. Roman concrete formulations have been partially lost. We have evidence that these technologies existed and were sophisticated, but we don't fully understand them. We're constantly rediscovering lost techniques or figuring out how ancient people did things that we thought required modern technology. The Ptolemaic Egypt and Hellenistic syncretism. After Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, his general Ptolemy established the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemaic period saw a unique blending of Greek and Egyptian cultures. The Ptolemies adopted Egyptian religious practices while maintaining Greek political structures. But most of this distinctive cultural synthesis is lost to us. We know it existed through artifacts and surviving texts, but the full picture of Ptolemaic culture is incomplete. The Qumran community and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The people who lived at Qumran and hid the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves left no direct record of why they did so. They left no messages explaining their intentions. We can only infer from the texts themselves what the Qumran community believed and why they preserved these particular documents. The community that created this archive is gone. We have their preserved texts, but their voices and their explanations are silent. The Göktürk runestones and Central Asian history. The Göktürk people left behind stone inscriptions with runic script in Central Asia. These inscriptions provide information about Göktürk history and values, but much Göktürk history is lost. They left fewer written records than many other civilizations. Their oral traditions were not always transcribed. The full extent of Göktürk civilization and their contributions to world history are incompletely known. The Nabatean roads and trade network extent. While we know the Nabateans controlled trade routes, the full extent of their network is incompletely understood. Archaeological surveys keep finding traces of roads and way stations that were previously unknown. We're still discovering the full scope of their commercial reach. This suggests that many ancient trade networks were more extensive than previously thought, and parts of them are still unknown. The Library of Timbuktu and African Intellectual History. In the city of Timbuktu in Mali, there was a significant Islamic university and library containing thousands of manuscripts on science, mathematics, theology, and history. These texts show that medieval Africa had sophisticated intellectual traditions, but many of these texts have been lost over time. Some were destroyed in conflicts, some were lost to decay. The full intellectual heritage of medieval Africa is incompletely preserved. We're only now beginning to recover and study the surviving texts. The unknown causes of civilizational collapse. Many civilizations have disappeared or collapsed. The Minoan civilization, the late Bronze Age civilizations, the Maya civilization, the Easter Island civilization. We have various theories about why they collapsed, but we don't have complete information. We don't know all the factors that contributed. We're speculating based on incomplete archaeological and historical records. The true causes of civilizational collapse are partially hidden by time. The Silk Road as a cultural transmission network. The Silk Road was not just a trade route. It was a network through which diseases, ideas, religions, technologies, and culture flowed. Buddhism spread to China along the Silk Road. Islam spread to Central Asia and eventually to China. Technologies like papermaking and printing spread from China westward. But the full extent of this cultural exchange is not completely documented. There were probably ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that spread along the Silk Road but left no permanent trace. The intellectual history of Eurasia during the period of active Silk Road trade is partially hidden. The Library of Pergamon's influence on later culture. The library at Pergamon influenced scholars for centuries. Greek texts were copied there and spread through the Mediterranean, but not all the texts copied at Pergamon survive. Not all the scholarly work done there is documented. The intellectual contributions of Pergamon scholars are partially lost. We know the library was important because of its reputation, but we don't fully know what it accomplished. The unknown voices of ancient women. For most of history, women's voices were not recorded or preserved. There were likely female scholars, philosophers, scientists, and writers whose works were not preserved because women's intellectual contributions were not valued in the same way as men's. We have a few female writers from antiquity whose works survived, like Sappho or Hypatia, but we know that many women must have had ideas and knowledge that were lost because they were not recorded. The intellectual history of antiquity is incomplete because half of humanity's voices were largely excluded. The Aksum Empire and East African history. The Kingdom of Aksum was a major power in East Africa and beyond, controlling trade routes and maintaining diplomatic relations with Rome, Persia, and India. But the history of Aksum is incompletely known. Many records are lost. The full extent of their civilization and their influence is only partially understood. Aksumite coins and inscriptions provide some information, but much more is missing. The Xiongnu Confederation and steppe history. The Xiongnu were a confederation of nomadic peoples on the steppe north of China. They had complex political structures and significant military power. But their history, as known to us, comes primarily through Chinese sources. Xiongnu sources and records are largely lost. We see them through the lens of their enemies and competitors. Our understanding of Xiongnu civilization is incomplete and likely biased by the sources that survived, the Nabatean desert cities. The Nabateans built cities in the desert that were marvels of engineering and urban planning. But as political conditions changed and trade routes shifted, many of these cities were abandoned. Petra is famous and well preserved because of its location and the rocks it was carved into, but there were other Nabatean settlements that are less well known. Some have been excavated, others probably still lie beneath the sand, unknown and unstudied. The unknown depths of ancient archives. We've only begun to explore what's contained in ancient archives. Scholars are still cataloging and translating texts that have been known for centuries. New interpretations of old texts are constantly emerging. Texts that were thought to mean one thing are reinterpreted. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still being studied and analyzed. Ancient Egyptian texts are still being translated and interpreted. The full knowledge contained in historical documents is still being extracted. The Library of Nalanda and Buddhist Intellectual History, Nalanda University in ancient India, was a great center of Buddhist learning where scholars from across Asia came to study. But Nalanda was destroyed and sacked by invaders. Many texts that were preserved there were lost or scattered. Buddhist intellectual traditions that were preserved at Nalanda are incompletely known to us. The destruction of Nalanda represented a significant loss to human knowledge and intellectual history. The hidden history of paper technology. Paper was invented in China around the 2nd century AD, but the knowledge of papermaking was kept secret for centuries. When the technology eventually spread westward, it transformed Islamic civilization, which then transmitted it to Europe. But the journey of this technology westward was not straightforward. Knowledge was lost and rediscovered. Techniques varied, some methods died out. Only fragments of the original Chinese papermaking knowledge survive. The process we use to make paper today is probably quite different from the original Chinese method, but we'll never know exactly how different because the original detailed knowledge is lost to time. The Hittite laws and lost legal systems. The Code of Hammurabi is famous, but the Hittites had their own sophisticated legal system. Their laws dealt with complex issues like inheritance, commerce, military obligations, and personal conduct. But much of Hittite law is known to us only through fragmentary texts. We have clay tablets containing laws, but they're incomplete. Some tablets have broken sections. Some laws are referenced but not fully explained. The complete Hittite legal system, the full philosophy behind their laws, remains partially obscure. We're interpreting fragments of a system that once made complete sense to those who lived within it. The Nabatean language and communication. The Nabateans spoke Arabic and developed a script that influenced later Arabic writing. But the exact form of their language at different points in history is not completely known. We have inscriptions and texts, but no complete texts explaining grammar or providing extensive examples of everyday communication. We know how they wrote, but we don't fully know how they spoke or how their language evolved. The living, spoken language of the Nabateans is gone forever. We only have the written fragments that were formal enough or important enough to be inscribed on stone or preserved in other ways. The Byzantine preservation of ancient knowledge. During the medieval period in Western Europe, much classical knowledge would have been lost were it not for Byzantine scholars who continued copying and preserving texts. Byzantine monasteries kept alive the knowledge of ancient Greek and Latin, but many Byzantine texts are also lost. When Constantinople fell, some libraries were preserved, others were destroyed or dispersed. Some texts were taken to Europe where they were preserved, but how many texts were lost in the confusion of the conquest? How many Byzantine scholars had personal collections that were destroyed? We'll never know. The Library of Ctesiphon and Sassanid Knowledge. Ctesiphon was the capital of the Sassanid Persian Empire, and it had a great library. But when the city was conquered by Islamic forces, the library was destroyed. Most of the texts in it were lost. What remains of Sassanid knowledge comes from texts that were scattered to other locations or from references in Islamic texts. The complete intellectual heritage of the Sassanid Empire is incompletely preserved. There was probably Sassanid scientific and philosophical knowledge that had no equal in the Islamic world, but is now lost. The cuneiform texts we haven't deciphered. While we've made great progress in reading cuneiform, there are still thousands of tablets that are difficult to interpret. Some tablets contain text we can phonetically read, but whose meaning is obscure. Some tablets are partially damaged, making interpretation difficult. There are probably insights into ancient Mesopotamian life and thought contained in these difficult texts that we're missing because we can't fully interpret them. New translations and interpretations of old texts are constantly emerging, suggesting that our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia is still evolving. The unknown population of ancient Rome. Historians have debated the population of the Roman Empire at its height. Estimates range from 50 to 100 million people, but we don't have precise census records. We have incomplete data from different periods. We're extrapolating from fragmentary information. The actual population distribution, the actual numbers of people living in different regions, is only approximately known. And since population affects everything from economic activity to military capability to cultural production, our understanding of Roman civilization is based partly on uncertain population estimates. The Library of Ephesus and the Seven Wonders. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was a major temple, a major center of religious life, and possibly a center of learning. But when the temple was destroyed by invaders and then rebuilt, the library that might have been associated with it was lost. What knowledge was kept at the Temple of Artemis? What texts might have been preserved there? We can only speculate. The destruction of great temples often meant the destruction of knowledge that was kept in them. The Mycenaean collapse and lost Bronze Age knowledge. The late Bronze Age civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks, experienced a sudden collapse around 1200 BC. The reasons for this collapse are still debated: invasion, climate change, economic disruption, or a combination of factors. But what's clear is that knowledge was lost in this collapse. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks fell apart. The cultures that had flourished in the Bronze Age were disrupted or destroyed. The knowledge they possessed, the technologies they had developed, much of it was lost. When civilization re-emerged in Greece during the Archaic period, it was a very different civilization. The connection to Bronze Age knowledge was broken. The lost city of Pompeii before excavation. Pompeii was buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, but by the time archaeologists began systematic excavation in the 1800s, the city had already been partially looted and damaged. Earlier excavators had removed artifacts without carefully recording their locations. Some areas had been partially excavated and then lost again. The full record of what was in Pompeii before eruption is incomplete. We know what survived the eruption and what has been excavated, but much has been lost or disturbed by centuries of treasure hunting before archaeology became systematic, the quipu of the Inca, and alternative record systems. The Inca quipu system was a three-dimensional recording system using knotted cords, but there may have been other similar systems used by other cultures that we've never discovered. There were probably recording systems that didn't survive or that we don't recognize as recording systems. The knowledge that the Inca possessed about how to encode information in knots is largely lost. We can see that they did it, but we don't fully understand their system. Some scholars are working to decode the quipus, but much of the meaning of many quipus remains obscure. The Sumerian king list and historical accuracy. The Sumerian king list is an ancient text that lists the kings of Sumer with their reign lengths, but the accuracy of this list is unclear. Some of the reign lengths are impossibly long. Some kings listed may not have been historical. The list was probably compiled from various sources, some mythological, some historical. We use it as a historical source, but with caution. It's a mixture of legend and history, and we don't always know where the line between them is. Many historical records contain this mixture, and we have to try to separate fact from legend without complete information. The Nabatean religious practices and lost beliefs. We know the Nabateans had religious practices and beliefs, but much of their religion is unknown to us. Some Nabatean religious sites have been excavated. Some inscriptions mention divine names, but the complete picture of Nabatean religious thought and practice is not available. They probably had myths, theological ideas, and religious stories that are completely lost. Their understanding of the sacred has vanished with them. The library of Susa and Elamite history. Susa was a major city in ancient Persia, and it had a library containing texts in multiple languages, but much of the library was lost when the city was sacked. The texts that survived have given us insights into Elamite culture and language, but we know we're only seeing a fragment. There were probably important Elamite texts that are gone. The full intellectual and cultural life of Elamite civilization is incompletely preserved. The unknown extent of Viking exploration. The Norse explored far beyond what is commonly known. They sailed to North America, reaching Vineland. They probably sailed to other locations in the Atlantic, but the extent of their voyages is not completely documented. Any maps they had are lost. Any records of their voyages that didn't involve significant settlements or conflicts are probably lost. We're piecing together Norse exploration from fragmentary archaeological evidence and from occasional references in sagas that may or may not be historically accurate. The true extent of Norse exploration remains somewhat mysterious. The Minoan civilization and undeciphered scripts. The Minoan civilization on Crete created a sophisticated culture. They had writing systems, linear A and linear B. Linear B has been deciphered and shows a form of Greek, but linear A, the earlier script, remains largely undeciphered. This means we can read linear A phonetically, but often don't understand the meaning. Much of Minoan knowledge and history is locked in this undeciphered script. Their myths, their laws, their history, partially inaccessible to us. The lost scrolls of Herculaneum. When Mount Vesuvius erupted, it buried not only Pompeii, but also Herculaneum. At Herculaneum, many papyrus scrolls were preserved. These scrolls contain philosophical texts, personal letters, and administrative documents, but many of these scrolls were damaged by the eruption, and others are still not fully read. Some scrolls are so tightly rolled and carbonized that they can't be safely opened. New technology like X-ray imaging is allowing us to read some of these previously inaccessible scrolls, revealing new information. But there are still scrolls that contain secrets we haven't accessed yet. They're waiting to be read, containing knowledge that has been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. The Etruscan religious practices and augury. The Etruscans were known for their sophisticated system of divination, reading the entrails of animals to predict the future. Roman emperors later adopted these practices and kept teams of Etruscan experts. but the full details of Etruscan augury practice are lost. We know they did it. We know some general principles. But the specific techniques, the specific meanings assigned to different signs, much of this knowledge is gone. The Etruscan experts eventually died out, and their detailed knowledge was not written down or was lost. The Library of Baghdad and Islamic intellectual life. Baghdad was a center of Islamic learning for centuries. It had great libraries where scholars translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and other texts, preserving them for posterity. But much of the library was destroyed when Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols in 1256. The destruction was catastrophic. Thousands of manuscripts were burned, but not all were destroyed. Some texts had been copied elsewhere. Some survived in other libraries, but the loss was immense. And we know that Baghdad had texts that were unique, not copied elsewhere. Knowledge was lost in that destruction, the unknown lives of ordinary people. Most of history is focused on rulers, generals, philosophers, and other famous people, but the vast majority of people who lived in the past left no records. We don't know their names, their thoughts, their daily experiences. We've only recently begun to try to understand the lives of ordinary people through archaeology and through careful reading of documents, but most of the ordinary lives of history are completely unknown to us. We have no way to access them. The daily thoughts and experiences of billions of people are simply gone, lost to time. History is biased toward the famous and the powerful because they're the ones whose voices were recorded. The mystery of Easter Island's decline. Easter Island had a sophisticated civilization that created the famous Moai statues, but the civilization declined and collapsed. The reasons for this decline are debated. It may have been due to overexploitation of resources, internal conflict, or environmental change. But what is certain is that knowledge was lost in this collapse. The techniques for carving and moving the Moai were eventually forgotten. The civilization that had created these remarkable statues couldn't continue to maintain its cultural practices. Some knowledge of Easter Island culture survived through the oral traditions of the surviving population, but much was lost. The final truth about history's mysteries. The truth is that history is not a complete narrative with all the pieces known. History is fragmentary. It's what has survived, what has been preserved, what someone chose to keep, or what accident kept. It's texts on enduring materials. It's stone and clay and a few lucky parchments. It's stories that were told and retold and eventually written down. It's the voices that were loud enough or important enough to be recorded. Most voices, most knowledge, most ideas from history are simply gone. We know only what has survived, and what has survived is probably not representative of what actually existed. Every fact we know about history is built on incomplete information. We're always making inferences. We're always filling gaps with theories. We're always speculating about what we don't know. But this is what makes history fascinating. The mysteries remain. The unknowns persist. New discoveries are still being made that surprise us and force us to reconsider what we thought we knew. History is not a finished subject. It's an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, mediated by the fragmentary traces that survive. The fragmentary nature of history should humble us. We think we know the world. We think we understand our past, but we're constantly surprised by new discoveries. A new archaeological site is found. A new interpretation of old texts emerges. A technology is rediscovered that we forgot we ever knew. The earth itself holds secrets, and with each dig, each exploration, each careful study of what we have, we learn that there's more we don't know than we ever realized. Consider the vastness of time. Humans have been on this earth for hundreds of thousands of years. Civilization has existed for only about 5,000 years, written records for even less than that. Of the millions of people who have lived, only a tiny fraction left any trace of their existence. Of all the knowledge that was created and understood by ancient peoples, only a fragment reached us. We are inheritors of a fragmentary legacy, trying to piece together a complete picture from broken pieces. But this incompleteness is also what makes history endlessly fascinating. There are always more questions, always more mysteries, always the possibility of new discoveries that will transform our understanding. The past is not a closed book. It's a mystery that is constantly being re-examined and reinterpreted, and as long as we keep asking questions and seeking answers, the past will continue to teach us. It will continue to surprise us. It will continue to remind us of how much we don't know and how much there is still to learn. So the next time you read a historical fact or watch a documentary about the past, remember that you're only seeing a fragment of what actually happened. Remember that there are gaps in the record. Remember that scholars are still arguing about what different historical events mean and what caused them. Remember that new discoveries are being made all the time that change our understanding. History is not fixed. It's evolving. It's growing. It's being continuously rewritten as we learn more. And most importantly, remember that you don't know everything about history. Neither does anyone. The past is too vast, too complex, too filled with lives and events that were never recorded. We are all ignorant of most of history, and that ignorance is actually a blessing, because it means there are always new things to discover. There are always mysteries waiting to be solved. The digital age and information preservation. We often assume that because we have more information than ever before, we're better at preserving history. But digital information is actually quite fragile. Files become corrupted, formats become obsolete, servers crash, hard drives fail. We might think we're preserving more information by putting it online, but we're also creating new vulnerabilities. Some scholars worry that less information will survive from the digital age than from earlier periods. A medieval manuscript can last centuries if preserved properly. A digital file can vanish if the technology that reads it becomes obsolete and no one migrates it to a new format. Future archaeologists might find it harder to recover 21st century history than medieval history because the preservation of digital information was not prioritized until it was too late. The forgotten saints and religious history. Medieval Christianity had thousands of saints, many of whom are now completely forgotten. We know their names from old calendars or passing references, but we have no information about who they were or what they did. Some may have been important religious figures in their own time. Some may have had important teachings that are now lost. The religious landscape of medieval Christianity is incompletely preserved because many minor figures simply vanished from memory, and with them, knowledge of local religious practices, local theology, local spiritual movements. The unknown extent of medieval learning. We often think of the medieval period as a dark age of ignorance, but medieval monasteries and cathedral schools preserved classical knowledge and developed new knowledge, but much medieval learning is lost. Many manuscripts were created and then lost or destroyed. Many scholars' works are known to us only through fragmentary references. A medieval scholar might have written dozens of texts, but only 2 or 3 survive. The breadth and depth of medieval learning is incompletely known to us because so much has been lost. The trade networks. We haven't discovered. We know about the Silk Road, but there were probably many other trade networks whose extent we don't fully understand. There were probably trade routes by sea that connected distant regions. There were probably overland routes that connected people and cultures. But the full map of ancient and medieval trade is not known. Every time an archaeological survey is done in a new area, scholars find evidence of trade connections that were previously unknown. This suggests that the interconnectedness of the ancient and medieval world was even greater than we realized. The languages that disappeared without a trace. Throughout history, languages have disappeared. When speakers of a language die out or are assimilated into another culture, their language can vanish completely. We have no record of how many languages existed in the past. We know about languages that had written records or that were documented by other peoples, but thousands of languages probably existed and disappeared without leaving any trace. The diversity of human language throughout history is incompletely known to us. The unknown population movements. Historians study migrations and population movements, but they're basing their understanding on incomplete information. Genetic evidence and archaeological evidence have revealed previously unknown migration patterns, but the full story of how human populations moved and interacted is not completely known. There were probably movements of peoples that left little archaeological trace. There were probably interactions between peoples that were not recorded. The human geography of ancient history is more complex than we realize. The forgotten crafts and technologies. There were crafts and technologies that existed in ancient and medieval times that have been completely lost. We know about some of them through references in texts or through studying artifacts, but there were probably many crafts that disappeared because there was no economic incentive to preserve them. A technology that was useful in one context became obsolete in another. No one bothered to document it, and by the time someone wanted to know how it was done, everyone who knew was dead. The unknown connections between ancient civilizations. We're constantly discovering that ancient civilizations had more contact and influence on each other than we previously realized. Trade connections linked distant regions. Ideas and technologies spread across vast distances, but we're still discovering new connections. We're still finding evidence of contact where we didn't know it existed. The full network of ancient connections is incompletely mapped. There were probably connections that left so little trace that we'll never discover them. The lost oral traditions. Before writing, human knowledge was preserved in oral traditions. Stories were memorized and passed down, but oral traditions are fragile. A good storyteller dies, and if the stories haven't been passed to someone else, they're lost. Across human history, countless stories and traditions have vanished this way. Only a fraction of ancient oral traditions were ever written down. Those that were written down are preserved. Those that weren't are gone forever. We have no way of knowing what knowledge was lost when oral traditions died out without being recorded. The unknown architecture of ancient cities. We know the layout of some ancient cities from archaeological excavation, but most ancient cities are not completely excavated. Many are built over by modern cities, making full excavation impossible. We know fragments of ancient urban layout. We don't know the complete picture. There were probably urban features that made sense to the people living there that we don't understand because we only have partial information about the layout of their cities. The forgotten poets and writers. We know the names of some ancient poets and writers only because their work survived or because they're mentioned in other texts, but there were probably poets and writers who were well known in their own time whose work is now completely lost. There were probably important philosophical texts that were created and appreciated in antiquity that we know nothing about. The literary heritage of antiquity is fragmentary. We're reading only the texts that happened to survive. The unknown extent of ancient astronomy. Ancient peoples observed the stars and developed complex understanding of the heavens, but the extent of ancient astronomical knowledge is incompletely known. We have records of some ancient observations and theories, but there were probably sophisticated astronomical texts that are lost. There were probably ancient scholars who understood celestial mechanics in ways we don't know about. Their insights are lost to history. We study the astronomical texts that survived, but we don't know what didn't survive. The Library of Córdoba and Islamic Spain. In medieval Spain, the city of Córdoba had one of the greatest libraries of its time. It contained texts in Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and other languages. It represented the cultural interchange of medieval Spain, but much of the library was lost over time through wars, destruction, and decay. The intellectual richness of Islamic Spain is incompletely preserved. We know it was great, but we don't fully know what specific knowledge and ideas were lost when the library declined. The unknown monuments of ancient peoples. We know about the pyramids and the megaliths and other major monuments, but there were probably monuments that are now completely forgotten, structures that were built, that were impressive in their time, but that were destroyed or buried or simply fell into disrepair and were forgotten. Every few years, archaeologists discover ruins of ancient structures that were previously unknown. This suggests that there are probably many ancient monuments that we still haven't discovered. There are probably ruins that are hidden beneath modern cities or beneath the earth, waiting to be found. The forgotten rulers and dynasties' history is full of dynasties that rose and fell, but not all of them are well documented. Some rulers had short reigns. Some dynasties lasted only a few generations before being overthrown or assimilated. Their names survive perhaps in a historical list, but details about their reigns and their accomplishments are lost or fragmentary. Some dynasties are almost completely forgotten except for their impact on later events. The full political history of the ancient world is incompletely preserved because documentation was not consistent across all regions and all time periods. The unknown rituals and ceremonies. Ancient peoples had rituals and ceremonies that were important to them. We have fragmentary descriptions of some of them from historical sources, but we don't fully understand their significance. We don't know all the details of how they were performed. We don't know the spiritual or psychological significance they had for the people who participated in them. The ritual life of ancient peoples is incompletely known to us. We're interpreting fragments and making educated guesses about practices whose full meaning is lost. The Library of Alexandria's reconstruction. After the Library of Alexandria was damaged or destroyed multiple times, efforts were made to rebuild it. But the reconstructed library was never the equal of the original. The texts that were lost couldn't be replaced. Some copies existed elsewhere, but not all of them. The restoration efforts preserved important knowledge, but they couldn't preserve everything. Some texts that were in the original library were never replaced. The most important library of the ancient world was damaged by history, and its full collection was never recovered. The unknown extent of Roman roads. The Romans built an extensive road network throughout their empire, but the full extent of Roman roads is not completely documented. Archaeologists keep discovering roads that were previously unknown. Some roads have left faint traces that can only be detected from the air or through careful surveying. The network of Roman infrastructure was probably even more extensive than we realize, and with each road there was the movement of people and ideas and commerce that we don't fully understand. The lost cities beneath the sands. Across the Sahara Desert and throughout arid regions of the world, there are probably ancient cities buried beneath sand that have never been discovered. We know of some lost cities like Timbuktu and Gennaro in Mali, but there were probably many others. A city can be completely covered by sand dunes over centuries. The shifting desert can preserve or destroy civilizations. Some of these cities might contain libraries, might contain artifacts, might contain knowledge that would revolutionize our understanding of African and Middle Eastern history, but they remain buried, waiting, possibly forever unknown. The Nabatean water systems and engineering secrets. The Nabateans developed sophisticated water harvesting and distribution systems in the desert. They understood hydraulics and engineering in ways that allowed them to create cities in arid regions. But much of their specific engineering knowledge is lost. We see the results of their engineering in the structures that remain, but the detailed techniques, the mathematical principles they used, much of this is not documented. We're reverse engineering their knowledge from what survives, but we don't have their original texts explaining how they solved these problems. The Library of Ctesiphon and Sassanid Literature. The Sassanid Empire produced sophisticated literature, poetry, and philosophical texts. Their library at Ctesiphon was a center of learning. But when the Islamic conquest occurred, Most Sassanid texts were either lost or absorbed into Islamic culture and translated into Arabic. The original Pahlavi language texts are largely lost. We know about Sassanid literature only through fragmentary references and through copies that were made into Arabic. The complete body of Sassanid intellectual thought is incompletely preserved. The unknown extent of medieval learning in Africa. Medieval Africa had centers of learning that rivaled those in Europe and the Islamic world. Timbuktu, Djenné, and other West African cities had schools and libraries, but most of the texts created in these centers are lost. Some were destroyed by invaders, some decayed over time, some may still exist but have not been discovered. The intellectual heritage of medieval Africa is incompletely documented. We're only now beginning to recover and study the surviving texts from places like Timbuktu, and each discovery reveals that African intellectual history was far richer than previously acknowledged. The Nabatean caravan routes and hidden pathways. The Nabateans controlled vast caravan routes across the desert. These routes connected distant regions and facilitated trade and cultural exchange, but the exact routes of many of these caravans are not fully mapped. There were probably stopping points, water stations, and way stations that are now unknown or lost. The infrastructure that made long-distance trade possible in the ancient world is incompletely understood. We know some routes existed because of archaeological evidence, but there were probably many more that left little trace. The Library of Pergamon's influence on scholarship. Pergamon was known for having a great library and for producing parchment. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to study there, but the intellectual work done at Pergamon is incompletely known to us. Some of the texts produced there survived, but many did not. The scholarly conversations that happened at Pergamon, the debates and discussions, the research being conducted, most of this is lost. We have some works by scholars associated with Pergamon, but we don't have a complete picture of their intellectual contributions. The unknown population of medieval cities. We often don't know the exact population of medieval cities. We have rough estimates based on available land, known tax records, and archaeological evidence, but the actual population numbers are uncertain. This affects our understanding of medieval economies, food production, disease spread, and social organization. The fragmentary records of medieval times make it impossible to know precise populations. We're working with educated guesses about how many people lived in medieval cities and what that meant for their societies. The lost knowledge of ancient medicine. Ancient physicians had knowledge about treating diseases and injuries. They developed surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations, but much of this knowledge is lost. Some ancient medical texts survived, but many did not. We have fragmentary descriptions of ancient medical practices from texts that were preserved, but the complete pharmacopoeia of ancient medicine is unknown. There were probably effective treatments that worked, but were never documented or whose documentation was lost. Some knowledge that the ancients had about medicine was forgotten and had to be rediscovered. The Etruscan alphabet and writing systems. The Etruscans used an alphabet derived from Greek, but their language, written in this alphabet, remains largely undeciphered. We can read Etruscan phonetically, but often don't understand the meaning. There are thousands of Etruscan inscriptions on artifacts, but their full meaning is locked away from us. This represents a massive loss of knowledge. All the information contained in Etruscan texts is essentially inaccessible to us. We're looking at evidence of a civilization but can't read what they wrote. The Library of Cordoba's intellectual exchange. Medieval Cordoba was a center of intellectual exchange between Islamic, Jewish, and Christian scholars. Texts were translated from Arabic to Latin and Hebrew, and vice versa. Ideas spread across the three religions through this translation and exchange, but much of the output of this intellectual exchange is lost. Some translated texts survive, but many do not. The conversations between scholars of different faiths, the collaborative works, much of this is not documented. We know that intellectual exchange was happening because of references in surviving texts, but the full extent of this exchange is unknown. The unknown extent of trade in luxury goods. Ancient and medieval peoples traded in luxury goods across vast distances. Silk from China, spices from India, perfumes from Arabia, all of these traveled long trade routes. But the full extent of this trade is incompletely documented. There were probably trade goods that left no archaeological trace. There were probably routes and exchanges that were never recorded. The economic history of the ancient and medieval world is based on fragmentary evidence of trade routes and goods. Much commerce probably occurred without leaving any historical trace. The lost manuscripts of the Islamic Golden Age. During the Islamic Golden Age, scholars made remarkable advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, but many of the texts they created are lost. Some were destroyed during wars or conflicts, some were lost when libraries were destroyed, some were simply not preserved because they were written on perishable materials. We have some texts from this period, but we're missing many. The intellectual achievements of Islamic scholars are incompletely documented. We know they accomplished remarkable things because of the texts that survived, but we don't know the full extent of their knowledge and discoveries. The Library of Baghdad and the preservation of Greek knowledge. When Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols, one of the greatest losses was the destruction of texts that had been preserved and collected there. Greek and Persian and Indian texts were housed in Baghdad's libraries. Some had been translated into Arabic, preserving them for posterity. But when the libraries were burned, many texts were lost. Some texts that had been unique copies were destroyed. Knowledge that had been collected from across the Islamic world and beyond was scattered or destroyed. The loss of Baghdad's libraries was catastrophic for human knowledge. The unknown lives of Byzantine scholars. Byzantine scholars preserved many classical texts, but the work of these scholars themselves is incompletely known. We know some of their names, we have some of their writings, but we don't know the full extent of their intellectual contributions. We don't know all the texts they studied or all the ideas they engaged with. Byzantine intellectual history is preserved only in fragments. We're seeing only the peak of a much larger mountain of scholarship that has mostly disappeared, the forgotten shrines and religious sites. Throughout the ancient and medieval world, there were shrines and religious sites that were important to local communities. Many of these sites were destroyed or forgotten. A shrine that was visited by pilgrims, that was maintained and supported, that represented the religious beliefs of a community, could be completely forgotten if the community dispersed or if the site was destroyed. Archaeological surveys occasionally discover remains of these forgotten sites, but we don't know how many remain undiscovered. The religious landscape of the ancient world is incompletely known to us. The lost formulas and recipes of antiquity. Ancient peoples had recipes for dyes, medicines, poisons, foods, and other substances. These recipes were often kept secret and passed down through families or guilds, but many of these recipes are lost. We don't know how ancient people created certain dyes or how they prepared certain medicines. Some formulas were recorded, but the texts are lost. Some were never recorded, existing only in memory and practice. The practical knowledge of ancient peoples, their techniques and methods, much of this is gone. The Nabatean trade in incense and perfumes. The Nabateans controlled trade in incense and perfumes from Arabia. These were luxury goods that traveled to Egypt, the Mediterranean, and beyond. But the exact routes of this trade, the exact quantities traded, the economic impact on different regions, much of this is incompletely documented. Trade records from the Nabatean period are fragmentary. We know this trade was significant, but we don't fully understand its scope and impact. The unknown extent of piracy in ancient seas. Pirates operated in ancient seas, attacking merchant ships and coastal settlements. but the full extent of piracy in ancient times is incompletely documented. Pirate attacks that weren't recorded in official histories are unknown to us. Pirates who left no written records are invisible to history. We know about some famous pirates or piracy incidents, but we don't know how much piracy was happening or how much of the ancient sea trade was affected by it. The dangers faced by ancient merchants are incompletely understood. The Library of the Temple of Heliopolis. In ancient Egypt, the Temple of Heliopolis housed a significant collection of religious and scientific texts, but most of these texts are lost. The temple was destroyed, and its library was scattered or destroyed. What we know about Heliopolis comes from fragmentary references and from occasional artifacts. The intellectual and religious knowledge housed at Heliopolis is incompletely preserved. There were probably advanced astronomical and mathematical texts at Heliopolis that have been lost, the lost cities of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula had civilizations and cities whose histories are incompletely known. Some cities have been excavated, like Petra and Palmyra, but there were probably many other cities whose ruins remain undiscovered or unexcavated. The history of the Arabian Peninsula before Islam is largely written by external sources. The perspectives and records of the Arabian peoples themselves are largely lost. We're seeing Arabian history through the eyes of outsiders, not through the internal records of Arabian civilization. The unknown extent of Roman trade with India. The Romans traded extensively with India, particularly after the discovery of how to navigate the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds. But the full extent of this trade is not completely documented. Trade records are fragmentary. We know some goods traveled between Rome and India, but we don't know the complete picture of commerce. There were probably significant trading posts and relationships that left little archaeological trace. The economic history of Roman-India trade is based on incomplete information. The forgotten languages of Central Asia was home to many peoples who spoke distinct languages. Some of these languages are known to us only through fragmentary texts or through references in other languages. Many languages probably existed and disappeared without leaving any trace. The linguistic diversity of Central Asia in the ancient and medieval periods is incompletely known. Some of the languages that developed there, if they existed, are completely unknown to us. We don't know what languages were spoken or what ideas were expressed in those languages. The Library of Susa and the preservation of Elamite knowledge. Susa was a major city in ancient Persia. It had archives containing official records and possibly other texts, but most of the Susa library is lost. The texts that were found have given us insights into Elamite and Persian history, but we're working with a fraction of what probably existed. There were probably important Elamite texts that would tell us much about their culture and civilization that are now lost. The destruction of Susa's archives meant the loss of knowledge about ancient Persian history. The unknown extent of slave trade in antiquity. Slavery existed in ancient civilizations, and there was probably a slave trade connecting different regions. But the full extent of the ancient slave trade is not completely documented. Records of specific slave transactions are rare. We don't know exact numbers of people who were enslaved or traded. The economic impact of slavery on ancient societies is calculated based on limited information. The experiences of enslaved people, the routes they traveled, the lives they lived, most of this is not recorded. The lost knowledge of ancient architecture. Ancient peoples built structures using methods and techniques that sometimes are not fully understood today. Stonework, structural engineering, construction methods. Some of these are documented in surviving texts or visible in standing structures, but much is lost. There were probably construction techniques that were lost when practitioners died and the knowledge wasn't recorded. We're constantly amazed by what ancient peoples accomplished, but we don't fully understand how they did it because their technical knowledge, their methods, much of it is incompletely documented. The Library of Memphis and Egyptian religious texts. Memphis was a major religious center in ancient Egypt. It had temples that housed religious texts and knowledge, but most of these texts are lost. We have some fragments and references, but the complete body of Memphis religious knowledge is unknown. There were probably theological texts and religious stories preserved at Memphis that would tell us much about Egyptian religion that have been lost. The religious understanding of ancient Egypt is based on fragmentary surviving texts, the Nabatean astronomy and star knowledge. The Nabateans, like many desert peoples, observed the stars and developed knowledge of astronomy. This knowledge was practical, useful for navigation and timekeeping, but the specifics of Nabatean astronomical knowledge are not well documented. We don't have texts explaining their understanding of the stars. We don't know what astronomical phenomena they observed or how they explained them. Their practical astronomical knowledge is largely lost to history. Desert peoples had sophisticated understandings of the sky, but much of this knowledge disappeared when the people who possessed it died. The unknown extent of medieval craftsmanship. Medieval craftspeople developed sophisticated techniques for working with various materials. Metal workers, stone workers, glass makers, textile workers, each had specific techniques and knowledge. Some of this knowledge was passed down and preserved. Some was lost when craftspeople died and the knowledge wasn't transmitted. We have some surviving medieval crafts and techniques, but we don't know the complete repertoire of medieval craftsmanship. There were probably techniques that were lost and had to be rediscovered, or are still unknown to us. The Library of Carthage and Lost African History Carthage was a major Mediterranean power. It had a significant library containing texts about North African, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern history. But when Carthage was destroyed by Rome, much of the library was lost. Some texts were scattered, some were destroyed, some survived in copies elsewhere, but much knowledge about Carthaginian and North African history is lost. We know about Carthage mainly through Roman sources, which were often biased. The Carthaginian perspective on history, their own records of their civilization, much of this is lost. The unknown population movements of the Silk Road. The Silk Road facilitated not just trade, but also population movement and cultural exchange. People moved along the Silk Road for trade, for religious reasons, for refugee purposes, but the full extent of this population movement is incompletely documented. We don't know how many people traveled on the Silk Road or exactly what routes they took. We don't know all the places they settled or the communities they established. The demographic history of Silk Road regions is based on fragmentary evidence. The lost stories of ancient seafarers. Ancient seafarers traveled vast distances, exploring new territories and establishing trade connections. But most of the stories of individual seafarers and their voyages are lost. We have some famous expeditions recorded in history, like those of Zheng He, but countless other voyages and explorers left no record. The experiences of ancient sailors, the discoveries they made, the dangers they faced, most of this is not documented. There were probably significant explorations and discoveries that are completely unknown to us because they weren't recorded. The unknown population movements of the Silk Road. The Silk Road facilitated not just trade, but also population movement and cultural exchange. People moved along the Silk Road for trade, for religious reasons, for refugee purposes. But the full extent of this population movement is incompletely documented. We don't know how many people traveled on the Silk Road or exactly what routes they took. We don't know all the places they settled or the communities they established. The demographic history of Silk Road regions is based on fragmentary evidence. The lost stories of ancient seafarers. Ancient seafarers traveled vast distances, exploring new territories and establishing trade connections. But most of the stories of individual seafarers and their voyages are lost. We have some famous expeditions recorded in history, like those of Zheng He, but countless other voyages and explorers left no record. The experiences of ancient sailors, the discoveries they made, the dangers they faced, Most of this is not documented. There were probably significant explorations and discoveries that are completely unknown to us because they weren't recorded. Entire continents might have been visited by ancient peoples whose visits left no permanent trace and no historical record. The unknown extent of religious conversion in antiquity. Religious ideas spread across the ancient world through trade, conquest, migration, and missionary efforts, but the full extent of religious conversion and change is incompletely documented. We don't know exactly how or when many regions converted to different religions. We don't know the pace of religious change or the resistance to it. Religious history is based partly on incomplete documentation of actual religious practices and beliefs. The spiritual landscape of the ancient world changed over time, but we don't fully understand how or why those changes occurred. There were probably significant religious movements that left little trace in history. Entire religious traditions might have existed and disappeared without leaving any record. The mystery of written language development. We see writing systems emerge in ancient civilizations, but we don't fully understand how writing developed. Did it develop independently in multiple places, or did it diffuse from one source? We have evidence of early writing systems like cuneiform and hieroglyphics, but we don't know all the intermediate steps of how people moved from pure orality to written language. There were probably early experimental forms of writing that have not survived. There were probably attempts at creating writing systems that failed and disappeared, leaving no trace. The development of writing is one of the most significant moments in human history, but our understanding of it is based on the written records that survived. The lost mathematical knowledge of antiquity, ancient peoples developed sophisticated mathematics. The Babylonians had advanced algebra. The Greeks developed geometry. Ancient Indians developed zero and the decimal system. But how much mathematical knowledge developed in other places and was lost? Were there other independent developments of advanced mathematics that disappeared? We know about the mathematics of certain civilizations because texts survived, but there were probably mathematical achievements in other places that left no record. The history of mathematics is probably far larger than we realize, with many contributions lost to time. The unknown extent of ancient philosophy. Ancient Greece is famous for its philosophers, but there were probably sophisticated philosophical traditions in other places that are now lost or incompletely documented. Africa, India, China, the Americas, all probably had philosophical traditions. Some of these we know about through surviving texts. Others are known to us only through fragmentary references. Probably many philosophical traditions existed and disappeared entirely without leaving any trace. The history of human thought is probably far richer than we realize, with countless perspectives lost to time. The forgotten gods and forgotten religions. Throughout history, religions have risen and fallen, but the vast majority of religions that ever existed are now completely forgotten. We only know about religions whose texts survived or whose impact on surviving civilizations was significant enough to be documented. But there were probably countless religions whose followers worshipped their gods sincerely and whose religious practices were important to them, but which completely disappeared. There were probably complex theological traditions that developed and then vanished without leaving any trace. The spiritual history of humanity is probably far vaster and far more complex than we can imagine. The unknown extent of military technology development. Different civilizations developed different military technologies, but the full extent of military innovation in the ancient world is incompletely documented. Weapons that were created, refined, and used, but which left little archaeological trace, are probably unknown to us. There were probably arms races in antiquity where different powers competed to develop superior weapons, but records of most of this competition are lost. The military history of the ancient world is based on incomplete information. Entire military innovations might have occurred and then disappeared as the technology became obsolete or the knowledge was lost. The lost recipes and cooking traditions. Different cultures developed different cuisines based on available ingredients and cultural preferences, but most ancient and medieval recipes and cooking techniques are lost. We have some recipes preserved in texts, but the majority of cooking knowledge probably disappeared. People learned to cook by observation and practice, not from written recipes. When cooks died without transmitting their knowledge to the next generation, that knowledge was lost. The culinary history of humanity is probably far richer than we know. There were probably sophisticated cuisines and cooking traditions that have completely disappeared. The unknown extent of textile production and design. Ancient peoples created textiles with sophisticated designs and techniques. We see examples of ancient textiles in museums, and they're remarkable for their complexity and beauty. But the full range of textile designs and techniques that existed is incompletely known. Many textiles deteriorate and don't survive. We have examples of what survived, but we don't know what was created that didn't survive. There were probably textile techniques that were refined and then lost, designs that were popular and then forgotten, colors that were created and then the knowledge of how to create them was lost. The mystery of lost artistic techniques. Ancient artists created remarkable works, but many artistic techniques are lost. We see paintings from Pompeii and wonder how they were created. We see sculpture and marvel at the skill, but the detailed techniques of how artists worked, the process they followed, the materials and methods they used, much of this is not documented. There were probably artistic schools and traditions where techniques were taught and refined, but this knowledge was not always recorded. The evolution of artistic technique is incompletely documented. There were probably artistic innovations that appeared and then disappeared as the artists who knew them died without recording or transmitting the knowledge. The unknown extent of epidemiology in history. Diseases have shaped human history, causing countless deaths and changing the course of civilizations. But our understanding of historical diseases and how they spread is based on fragmentary evidence. We don't know the true mortality rates of ancient plagues. We don't know how diseases evolved over time. We don't know all the diseases that existed in the past. Some diseases probably existed in antiquity, but have since disappeared. Some of the symptoms described in ancient texts might refer to diseases that no longer exist. The epidemiological history of humanity is probably far more complex than we realize. The lost knowledge of ancient mining. Ancient peoples mined metals and minerals using various techniques, but the specific mining methods of ancient civilizations are incompletely documented. We know they were successful at mining because we see the results, but we don't always know exactly how they did it. There were probably mining techniques that were effective but are now forgotten. There were probably mining sites that were operated and then abandoned, leaving no clear trace of the operations. The mining history of the ancient world is based on limited evidence. The unknown extent of ancient demographics. Understanding population size and distribution is crucial for understanding ancient history, but our demographic knowledge of ancient civilizations is based on educated guesses. We make estimates based on arable land, known settlements, and fragmentary historical records, but we don't know true population numbers. Different regions at different times probably had population densities that we have no way of knowing. The social history of the ancient world, the conditions people lived in, the quality of life, much of this depends on population estimates that might be significantly off. We're building our understanding of ancient life on shaky demographic foundations. The lost library of Pergamon's influence. Pergamon was known not just for having a great library, but for producing parchment. The library's collection influenced scholarship throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. But as the library was dispersed and as Pergamon declined in importance, the intellectual work done there was gradually lost. Some scholars who studied at Pergamon had an influence that we know about. But how many brilliant scholars studied at Pergamon, developed ideas there, and then those ideas were lost? How much scholarly work was done in Pergamon that disappeared when the library was scattered? The intellectual history of Pergamon and its influence on the broader ancient world is incompletely preserved. The final reckoning with historical fragmentation. What becomes clear when you study history in depth is that what we know is merely a fraction of what once existed. We are reading the fragments of a much larger text. We are seeing pieces of a picture whose full image is lost. Every historical period is incompletely documented. Every civilization left knowledge that is now inaccessible to us. Every culture has wisdom that has died with the last speaker of their language or the last practitioner of their traditions. We are inheritors of a vast collection of loss. We inherit what survived, but we don't inherit what was destroyed. Think about what this means for a moment. Right now, tonight, as you listen to these words, there are probably people somewhere trying to decipher an ancient text. There are archaeologists excavating a site. There are scholars arguing about the interpretation of a fragmentary historical source. They're all working with incomplete information. They're all making educated guesses about a past that is fundamentally unknowable in its totality. This is the human condition when it comes to history. We're always working with less than we need to fully understand what happened. But this is not cause for despair. This is cause for humility and wonder. Humility because we should recognize the limitations of our knowledge. We should be cautious about our certainties. We should acknowledge that what we think we know is often based on incomplete information. We should be suspicious of our own confidence. We should remember that scholars have been wrong before and will be wrong again. What we think we know about history might be completely overturned by new discoveries. What seems certain now might be revealed as based on faulty evidence or faulty reasoning. Wonder because there is always more to discover. There are always mysteries waiting to be solved. There is always the possibility that new discoveries will overturn what we thought we knew and reveal new dimensions of history. There is wonder in not knowing everything. There is wonder in the vastness of what remains hidden. The past is not dead. It's not a finished story. It's a conversation that is still ongoing. As we discover new texts, as we develop new technology to read old texts, as we excavate new sites, the past reveals itself to us in new ways. The past is constantly surprising us. It's constantly teaching us. It's constantly reminding us that we don't know as much as we think we do. New discoveries are being made all the time. Archaeologists are finding structures that were unknown. Scholars are translating texts that were previously thought to be untranslatable. Historians are making new connections between events that were previously thought to be unrelated. The past is still alive in the sense that it's still revealing itself, still teaching, still surprising. The lost murals and wall paintings of antiquity. Ancient peoples decorated walls with paintings and murals. Some of these have survived, like those at Pompeii, but most ancient wall paintings have been lost. Walls have been destroyed or painted over. The frescoes have faded or deteriorated. In places like Pompeii, we can see what survived, but in most other places, we have no idea what art once decorated the walls of ancient buildings. There were probably remarkable artistic achievements in wall painting that have completely disappeared. The visual artistic heritage of the ancient world is incomplete because most wall paintings have not survived. The medieval intellectual landscape and lost scholarship. During the medieval period in Europe, scholarship was preserved primarily in monasteries and cathedral schools, but this preservation was incomplete and selective. Monks copied texts that they considered important, but many texts were not copied. Texts were damaged or destroyed in fires. Some monastic libraries were lost entirely when monasteries were destroyed or abandoned. The intellectual landscape of medieval Europe is known to us through the texts that happened to survive in monastic institutions. But there was probably much intellectual activity happening outside of the monasteries among secular scholars and craftspeople whose work left no written record. The medieval intellectual history that we know is skewed toward what the church preserved, the unknown extent of ancient fortifications. Ancient civilizations built fortifications to protect their settlements and strategic locations, but the full extent of ancient fortifications is not completely known. Archaeological surveys constantly discover ancient fortifications that were previously unknown. Some fortifications have left only faint traces that can be detected through aerial surveying or careful ground examination. We don't know the complete network of ancient defenses. There were probably fortifications that served important strategic purposes, but which have been completely destroyed or buried. The military geography of the ancient world is incompletely understood because our knowledge of ancient fortifications is incomplete. The lost protocols of ancient diplomacy. Ancient rulers conducted diplomatic relations with each other, treaties were negotiated, ambassadors were sent, but most of the details of ancient diplomacy are lost. We have some records of diplomatic events, some treaties that have been preserved, but the vast majority of diplomatic correspondence and protocols are gone. We don't know how ancient rulers conducted negotiations or what arguments they used. We don't know the diplomatic protocols and etiquette that were followed. The political relationships between ancient powers are incompletely understood because the diplomatic record is fragmentary. The unknown extent of ancient philosophy of nature. Ancient philosophers developed theories about the nature of the physical world, but the full range of ancient scientific and philosophical thinking is incompletely documented. We know about some ancient philosophers because their works were preserved or because they were quoted by later philosophers, but there were probably many other thinkers whose work is completely lost. They might have developed theories that were wrong, or they might have discovered truths that we have since forgotten and rediscovered. The history of scientific thought is probably far richer and far more complex than our surviving sources suggest. The mystery of musical traditions. Lost ancient peoples created music and developed musical traditions, but most ancient music is lost. We have some descriptions of ancient musical instruments and musical theory from surviving texts. We have some musical notation from ancient sources, but the actual melodies of ancient music are almost entirely lost. We don't know what ancient music sounded like. We don't know the musical traditions that were developed and then forgotten. There were probably sophisticated musical traditions in ancient civilizations that have completely disappeared. The musical history of humanity is probably far vaster than we can imagine, with most of it lost to time. The forgotten stories of ancient travelers. Ancient people traveled for trade, for religious reasons, for exploration, for military purposes. Some of these travelers had remarkable experiences. Some discovered new lands. Some encountered strange peoples and customs. But most of their stories are lost. We have some famous travelers' accounts preserved in writing or in legend, but countless other travelers left no record. Their experiences, their discoveries, their insights, most of this is lost. There were probably significant historical events triggered by ancient travelers that we know nothing about because no one recorded them. The unknown extent of urban planning in antiquity. Ancient cities were designed and planned. Some cities were built from scratch following a master plan, others developed gradually, but the full extent of ancient urban planning knowledge and practice is incompletely documented. We see the results in the remains of ancient cities, but we don't fully understand the principles and methods that ancient urban planners used. There were probably urban design ideas that were developed and then lost, cities that were planned according to sophisticated principles that are no longer understood. The history of urban planning in the ancient world is based on incomplete evidence from surviving city remains. The lost knowledge of ancient agriculture. Ancient peoples developed sophisticated agricultural techniques. They understood crop rotation, irrigation, terracing, and other methods of improving agricultural productivity. But many ancient agricultural techniques are lost. We have some descriptions in surviving texts, but the detailed practical knowledge of ancient farmers is largely gone. There were probably efficient growing methods that ancient farmers developed and that were lost as agricultural practice changed over time. Ancient farmers probably had detailed knowledge of local plants, soils, and climates that is now lost. The agricultural history of humanity is probably far more sophisticated than we realize, with much knowledge lost. The unknown extent of proto-industrialization in antiquity. Some ancient civilizations probably developed proto-industrial production methods in certain sectors, water mills, mechanical devices, mass production techniques for certain goods, but our knowledge of ancient technological development is incomplete. We don't know the full extent of mechanization in the ancient world. There were probably technological innovations that appeared and then disappeared when the knowledge was lost or when political conditions changed. The technological history of the ancient world is probably more advanced in some ways than we realize, with much knowledge lost to time. The forgotten minority, peoples and their contributions. Throughout history, minority peoples have lived alongside dominant powers. They've developed their own cultures, their own artistic traditions, their own contributions to civilization, but many of these minority peoples and their cultures are forgotten. We know about some minority cultures because they left monuments or because they were documented by dominant powers, but countless minority cultures have disappeared entirely from history. We don't know what unique contributions they made. We don't know the ideas they developed. The cultural history of humanity is probably far richer than we realize, with the contributions of countless minority peoples lost to time. The unknown fate of personal archives and libraries. Throughout history, scholars and important people have accumulated personal libraries and archives. When these people died, what happened to their collections? Some were preserved and became public libraries, some were scattered and lost, some were destroyed. If more personal collections had been preserved, we would probably know far more about ancient and medieval intellectual history. We would understand the reading habits of scholars, the ideas they engaged with, their personal thoughts, but most personal archives and libraries have been lost. We can only imagine what knowledge and perspectives have been lost when personal collections were scattered or destroyed. And so, as you rest with these thoughts, consider what it means to be living in a moment of history. You are part of history. Your actions, your words, your thoughts are becoming part of the historical record. Some of what you do will be remembered, some will be forgotten. Some of your knowledge might be preserved in writing or in digital form. Some might be lost when you die. Billions of people in the future will live their lives, and most of them will have no knowledge of your existence. But you are still part of history. You are still contributing to the story of humanity. And what you leave behind, whether it's written work or oral tradition, or simply the influence you have on others, will become part of the past that future generations will try to understand and reconstruct. And so we've journeyed through far more than 50 moments where history reveals its hidden depths. We've seen how much we don't know, how much has been lost, how much remains mysterious. We've explored the gaps in the historical record and come to understand that every civilization, every culture, every person who ever lived has left behind a fragmentary record at best. Most of human history is simply gone, inaccessible to us, lost to time, and to the perishable nature of all materials and all knowledge. The lesson of these facts is not that history is depressing or incomplete, though it certainly is. The real lesson is far more profound. It's that there's always more to know. There are always mysteries to solve, questions to ask, connections to make. The world is stranger and more complex than we usually acknowledge, and the past is far deeper and more intricate than we ever realize until we start looking beneath the surface. As you rest with these thoughts, your mind drifting between wakefulness and sleep, consider what it means that so much of human history is hidden from us. Consider what knowledge has been lost to fire and flood and decay. Consider the thousands of languages that no one speaks anymore. Consider the billions of people whose names we'll never know, whose thoughts we'll never access, whose lives left no trace that reached us. Consider what we might be entirely wrong about because we're basing our understanding on incomplete information. We think we know history, but we know only what has survived. What has been destroyed far exceeds what remains. The visible past is dwarfed by the invisible past, the part that has been lost. History is not a fixed thing. It's not a finished narrative. It's constantly being rewritten as new discoveries emerge. As we develop better technology to read old texts, to excavate deeper, to examine artifacts more carefully, the past reveals itself to us in new ways. New interpretations emerge. Old certainties are questioned. Mysteries remain mysteries, but we understand them more deeply. The past continues to teach us if we're willing to listen. Every new discovery is a conversation between the present and the past, mediated by the fragmentary evidence that has survived. The fragmentary nature of historical knowledge should humble us. It should make us cautious about our certainties. It should make us realize that there are entire dimensions of the past that we're not even aware we're missing. We don't know what we don't know. There are probably vast areas of human history that we have almost no information about, entire civilizations that we know nothing about, entire technologies that were invented and lost, entire philosophical systems that developed and disappeared, entire artistic movements that created remarkable works that have all been destroyed. We're operating with incomplete information, and we need to acknowledge that. Someone in 1,000 years might look back at our civilization and wonder what we were doing with all our technology and all our records. They might have discovered things about us that completely change how we understand ourselves, or they might have very little information about us at all if, for some reason, most of our digital records are lost or become unreadable. Digital storage is fragile, formats become obsolete, servers crash. The amount of information we're creating now is staggering, but how much of it will actually be preserved for future generations? We might think we're preserving everything, but we might be setting ourselves up for massive information loss if we're not careful about how we preserve digital data. Thank you for taking this journey through time with me. Thank you for being willing to rest with these mysteries and these fragmentary facts. Thank you for allowing your mind to wander through the hidden history of humanity, the untold stories, the lost knowledge, the forgotten peoples. History, real history, the hidden history is far more interesting than anyone tells you. It's stranger, it's more complex, it's more humbling, and it never stops surprising us. Every time we think we've figured something out, new evidence emerges that forces us to reconsider. Every time we think we know the full story, a previously unknown document is discovered that changes everything. The story continues. More facts are waiting to be discovered. More mysteries are waiting to be solved. More history is being made as we speak. Somewhere, an archaeologist is uncovering ruins that will change our understanding of an ancient civilization. Somewhere, a scholar is translating a text that was thought to be incomprehensible, and it's revealing knowledge that has been locked away for centuries. Somewhere, a historian is making connections between events that were never connected before, revealing patterns in history that we didn't know existed. Somewhere, a young person is starting to study history and will dedicate their life to uncovering and understanding the past. And through all of this, the past continues to reveal itself, fragment by fragment. Sleep well, knowing that the world is far stranger and far more complex than you realized. Sleep with the understanding that what we know about history is merely the tip of an iceberg, and the vast bulk of history remains beneath the surface, partially submerged, difficult to access, maybe forever inaccessible. Wake up knowing that every day new discoveries are being made that might change how we understand the past. Wake up knowing that somewhere, someone is uncovering history's secrets. And most importantly, remember that you are part of history now. Your actions, your words, your choices, your thoughts are becoming part of the historical record. Some of it might be remembered, some might be recorded, some might be preserved, but most of it will fade, most of it will be forgotten. But it still matters. It still contributes to the great tapestry of human history. What will you leave behind for future generations to discover? What traces of your existence will persist after you're gone? Will there be records of your thoughts? Will there be evidence of your influence? Will someone, centuries from now, stumble upon something you did or wrote and wonder about you? Probably not. Probably your life, like the lives of billions of others, will leave almost no trace in the historical record. But you're still part of history. You're still participating in the human story. And that story, fragmentary as it is, incomplete as it must be, continues on. It continues through you. It continues through the choices you make and the words you speak and the ideas you share. You are a link in the chain that connects the past to the future. And what you do in this moment, in this present time that is passing into history even as you experience it, matters. Every moment matters. Every choice matters. Because every moment and every choice becomes part of the historical record, even if no one will know about it. So rest now. Let these thoughts settle into your mind as you drift toward sleep. Let the mysteries of history wash over you without demanding answers. Let the fragmentary nature of what we know remind you of the vastness of what we don't know. And in that vastness, in that unknowing, find peace, find wonder, find the humility that comes from understanding that we know so little, have seen so little, have preserved so little of the vast human story that has unfolded across thousands of years. We are mere observers of history, looking back at fragments and trying to piece together the whole. And that's okay. That's the human condition when it comes to understanding the past. History is not something that happened in the past. History is something that is happening now. You are history. I am history. Everyone you've ever met is history. What we do ripples forward into a future we'll never see, creating history that future generations will try to understand and reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. And someday, they might wonder about us. They might dig through digital archives or physical remains and try to figure out who we were and what we were thinking. They might find clues to our lives and try to piece together the story of our civilization. And they will get it partially wrong. They will miss crucial context. They will make assumptions based on incomplete information. They will do what all historians do. They will make sense of fragments and call it the past. And in doing so, they'll be continuing the great human project of understanding our history, even though that history will always be incomplete. But that's all we can ever do. That's all any generation can do. We inherit a fragmentary legacy. We try to understand it. We add to it, we pass it forward, and then we die. And the next generation inherits what we've left behind, and they do the same thing, and on it goes. The great chain of history, each generation standing on the shoulders of those who came before, adding their own links to the chain, even knowing that most of those links will eventually disappear, forgotten, lost, inaccessible to the future. We're all temporary. Our knowledge is temporary. Our accomplishments are temporary. But in our temporary existence, we contribute to something larger than ourselves. We contribute to the ongoing human story. So as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, remember the hidden history. Remember the lost libraries and the forgotten peoples. Remember the languages that no one speaks anymore, and the knowledge that died with the last expert who knew it. Remember that most of human history is lost to us, that what we think we know is probably incomplete, that the world is far more mysterious than we usually admit. And in that remembrance, find peace. Find the comfort that comes from understanding that we don't need to know everything. We don't need to have all the answers. We can live with mysteries. We can be comfortable with fragmentation. We can accept that the past will always be, to some degree, unknowable. And we can live in that unknowing, searching for truth, pursuing knowledge, solving mysteries, while accepting that every answer we find will raise new questions. This is what it means to engage with history, to be perpetually humbled by how much we don't know. This is the gift of history. This is what studying the past teaches us, not just facts, not just narratives, but humility, curiosity, wonder, an understanding that the world is deeper than we think, more complex than we realize, and infinitely more interesting than we give it credit for. So thank you one final time for traveling through history with me. Thank you for being willing to rest with mysteries. Thank you for allowing your mind to settle into the comfortable unknowing that comes from contemplating all that we've lost and all that we'll never know. And now, let yourself drift. Let the fragments of history settle like dust around you. Let sleep come, and perhaps, in your dreams, you'll discover new mysteries. You'll uncover hidden truths. You'll travel back through time and witness moments that no one has ever recorded. You'll see history as it actually was, not as the fragmentary records would suggest. And when you wake, you'll carry those dreams with you as another layer of mystery, another example of how the human mind creates its own history, its own narratives, its own fragments of meaning in the vast unknowing of existence. Sleep well, keeper of history. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Sleep well, knowing that your dreams and your waking thoughts are all part of the great tapestry of human experience. Sleep well,